relations are at the worst point that they've been in a decade. But at the same time, U.S. farmers do a fairly substantial amount of business with Cuba. And Cubans in America maintain contact at home. They travel, they send remittances, they talk on the phone. They have a very good idea about what's going on in the island. But now, here we are. And so now that Fidel Castro is, well, he's not really gone, but he's not president anymore. Now that President Obama is now in charge, there's hope that we're going to change policy. Something's going to happen. It's going to be different. And I think there's a good reason to think that there's going to be some policy change. I mean, it's actually fairly likely. That's because the Bush administration swung the pendulum so far in the other direction that some change is almost inevitable. And for me, the question is how much change is there going to be and how soon is it going to come? Now, change can come from two different places, Congress or the administration. I'm going to start with Congress, and I'm going to kind of take care of that really quickly because I think change is going to start with the administration. That said, Congress has tinkered around the edges already this year with respect to Cuba policy. They made some very minor changes in the omnibus appropriations bill that Obama signed last month. The changes in and of themselves weren't substantial. In fact, they were mainly symbolic. But they were also important because they were symbolic. And they also led the Obama administration to roll back the Bush administration's restrictions on the ability of Cuban Americans to travel to Cuba. So Cuban Americans can now travel once per year. I'm skeptical, though, that any dramatic change is going to happen with Congress in the near term. The politics in Congress are still very sensitive on Cuba, which is something we'll get into in the discussion, if you like. Now, Congress may tinker around the edges, and there are certainly important people who want policy to change, like Senator Richard Lugar and Congressman Charlie Rangel. I think if there are also important members that don't want policy to change and can hold up movement to change on Cuban policy. So for that reason, I think change is going to begin, or more dramatic change is going to come from President Obama. I want to say a word about why President Obama might act on Cuban policy and whether or not he's able to do so, because you have this idea hanging out there that Helms-Burton prevents the president from changing policy. So first, Obama has the ability to change policy. The idea that Congress has somehow limited President Obama's ability to change policy is a myth. When Helms-Burton codified the embargo, it also codified the president's licensing authority. So basically it says, everything is prohibited except that which the president licensed. So full normalization may require an act of Congress, except there's a whole heck of a lot of things that the president can do in the meantime. He could exempt other products from U.S. sanctions. He could permit direct banking services through a license. He could encourage micro-lending if the Cuban government would allow the United States to lend funds to, say, small Cuban farmers. Now, there's one area where the president is restricted from acting, though, and that's with respect to restoring full travel for U.S. citizens. The quid pro quo in passing TISRA, which allowed agricultural sales, was that pro-embargo members of Congress insisted on a provision that prohibits the president from changing and from restoring travel for tourism purposes to Cuba. And there's no expiration to that prohibition, so at some point Congress is going to have to change it. For those people like me that would like policy to change, it's frustrating because this provision prevents the president from taking a fairly logical step that might improve relations and allow American citizens to act as ambassadors to Cuba. Now, as for why Obama may want to change policy, and I think he does, there are solid political and foreign policy reasons. First, the political. I had an opportunity to spend some time in Miami while I was working on this fellowship, and Miami's changing. The politics of Cuba are changing. Statewide demographics in Florida have changed. Florida's Hispanic population is now no longer majority Cuban, and it's also no longer majority Republican. It had been both for a long time. There's been a large influx of immigrants from Central and South America that voted overwhelmingly for Obama in November, and who don't agree with U.S.-Cuban policy. President Obama, in fact, won Florida without winning the Cuban-American vote. And then even within the Cuban-American community, while it would be incorrect to say that it has changed completely, it is certainly changing. And to give you an idea, Obama won the greater percentage of Cuban American voters than did President Clinton, even though President Clinton at the time embraced this kind of harder line on Cuba policy. And Obama, during the campaign, embraced the one thing that's anathema to most, or to a lot of Cuban Americans, which is negotiating with the Castro regime. And he still won. I think it was about 40%, maybe a little less than the vote. There are polls available. Florida International University released polls after the election which suggest that there's support for dramatic changes to U.S. policy towards Cuba. So that's the politics. I think changing U.S. Cuba policy would also be good for broader U.S. foreign policy. The Obama administration is facing a number of tough challenges right now: Iraq, Afghanistan, the entire Middle East and South Asia, the global financial crisis. This is one thing that the Obama administration could do fairly easily, fairly quickly, fairly simply to demonstrate a new approach to U.S. foreign policy. He knows this, and it's why you have advisors talking over the weekend and even today about the Obama administration wanting to roll back some additional restrictions on Cuban Americans in terms of their ability to travel and send money back to Cuba in advance of the Summit of the Americas, which is coming up in about 2 weeks. Changing Cuba policy, ending the embargo, is a priority for countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and a number of Caribbean countries. And it would be good for our image in the world. So those are the reasons why you might want to change policy. Now, what might change look like? I think in the short term, change is going to be fairly small and it will be incremental. President Obama is likely, before the Summit of the Americas, according to Jeff Davidoff, an advisor who spoke today, to remove all restrictions on the ability of Cuban Americans to travel to Cuba to visit family, and all restrictions on the ability of Cubans to send money to Cuba. Beyond that, it's an open question. Now, there are efforts underway in Congress to resume normal travel to Cuba, and I believe Davidoff suggested today that Obama may take a look at restoring normal travel for all citizens. At the very least, the Obama administration could go back to what travel existed during the Clinton administration, so he could restore the types of humanitarian, cultural, and educational exchanges that the Bush administration restricted. I think the president will move to do that fairly quickly, probably within the coming year. The second thing he can do, and which he's promised to do, is increase diplomatic contact with Cuba. I suspect there's not going to be an Obama-Castro summit anytime soon, but he could reinvigorate lower-level ties that had atrophied under the Bush administration. And that means migration talks, counter-narcotics talks, fence meetings for military talks, and figuring out what to do with Guantanamo Bay evidence. It's being closed as a prison. Obama's also likely to change the way that Cuba is treated within the State Department bureaucracy. President Bush created this thing called the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba. This was a PR nightmare for the United States as well. And in fact, the Cubans used it very adroitly. The Cuban government put up these billboards in Havana that said, "Thanks, President Bush, but with your El Plan Bush, as they call it, we're free already. We're free already. We have health care already. We don't need your help, and we don't need you Americans trying to come in and take control of our system." And so he's managed to instill this fear over time that the Americans are just out to get the Cubans. And I think for that reason, the commission and the reports that are produced were fairly bad for our image in Cuba. I think in order to get back to a better place in terms of trying to facilitate diplomatic contacts, President Obama is going to want to change that, dismantle the commission, and get back to kind of treating Cuba normally within the bureaucracy like we treat other countries. Beyond these initial steps, which I think will come incrementally but over the next year or so, the administration and Congress will have to address a number of other longer-term impediments to better relations. And so these are things like repealing Helms-Burton, removing Cuba from the State Department's list of states who sponsor terrorism, trademark issues which the United States has with Cuba, particularly Cuban rum and cigars, and